Hi everyone, my name is Asan Ahmad, and on behalf of Pendulum Global, I would like to welcome you to the webinar training series for the Girls Empowerment Campaign. In this video, we will be talking about gender equality, girls' rights, and the UN's commitment through the Sustainable Development Goals and other global initiatives further combating equality for girls and women. I'd like to start off by showing you a short video about gender equality and what it really means. The reason why I'm showing you the following video in particular is because it really does a great job of talking about gender and how it correlates with economic prosperity and multi-sector prosperity for a country. This video was made by World Fish Organization, which is an international nonprofit research organization, and they work to harness the potential of fisheries and aquaculture to reduce hunger and poverty. So although their goal and focus is geared more towards research and aquaculture, the underlying premise of gender is very similar, and it's actually exactly what is the focus of this video, so it does a great job of summing that up. So why don't you give it a watch, and we'll touch base after.
Gender inequality doesn't make sense on any level. By marginalizing the rights of women, we deny ourselves the opportunity to lift millions of men, women, and children out of poverty, not to mention the chance of a just and fair world. From birth, girls and boys, women and men are expected by society to play certain roles and behave in certain ways based on traditions, religion, and other beliefs. These behaviors are learned and shape the gender norms in a society. Unfortunately, in many countries, gender norms create disadvantages for women. Often, girls are not sent to school. When they become women, they then have limited ability to earn money or realize their potential. Rural women play a major role in agricultural development. However, in many developing countries, women cannot formally own land. Without land, they cannot get loans to invest in their farms or businesses. This also means they have no control over the use of land or the benefits that come from it. Men generally control the household decisions, like how to use the family's assets. These disadvantages are often reinforced by practices that limit women's access to services, like training. Cultural beliefs can also restrict women's opportunities, such as in parts of Zambia where women cannot paddle their boats as it is considered bad omen. The result of these issues? Women remain poor, and agricultural production cannot reach its potential, perpetuating poverty and hunger in the developing world. The social norms that limit women's opportunities need to be understood and then changed. By taking a gender transformative approach, we can influence social norms and bridge the gaps in access to resources and services between men and women in a lasting manner. Change is needed on many levels, and both men and women must be involved for it to happen. Research and development organizations need to invest in programs that promote gender equality alongside improving productivity and incomes. Policies need to be implemented that increase women's access to services and resources. Communities need to support women as farmers and as leaders. Increasing women's voice and agency is a valuable end in its own right. When development organizations, policies, and communities support the success of women, we have a chance to reduce extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity for girls and boys, women and men around the world.
I hope that was a really educational video that we just watched by World Fish Organization. I'd just like to point out again that that was World Fish Organization, and we are borrowing that video to share with you guys. To learn more, please go to worldfish.org. They do great work. Now, from that video, we really did learn that by marginalizing women, we disable the joint venture of a community to rise up and overcome poverty. And this is that's just a fact, right? From birth, we noted that there are conformities that both genders have to adhere to, and it's with these beliefs that induce socioeconomic inequality and power dynamics associated with gender. The behaviors that we now see very polarized and we title as gender inequality are learned, and they truly do shape gender roles. And the fact that these behaviors are learned can also act as hope, because if these are learned, then we can teach them differently in the future. But the challenge is, how do we now engage youth? How do we engage the next generation of learners to learn it in the most fair and equal way? As we noted, the current gender roles now later cultivate stigma, right? So if one was to deviate from the existing gender roles and from the existing status quo, the stigma associated with combating gender inequality is in itself an issue, because that limits girls, limits societies who want to progress and don't allow them to do so. We've also noted that gender roles are, particularly for women, can be very stunting. And this is because the systems in place do not encourage similar goals, such as going to school and acquiring an education. But I would like to acknowledge something, and that is that the paradigm is shifting. Very glacially, but arguably it is shifting, and only in select industrial geographies. But there is hope. And I would like to divert your attention now to the slide that is in front of you. And this slide here was a very interesting one to create, because I had the opportunity to discuss gender inequality with two young girls who are in India and in Pakistan. And both of them had a very uplifting perspective. And I like to really focus on Khatija, who is a 14-year-old girl from Pakistan. And something that Khatija said that really, made me feel, gave me all these goosebumps. And that was that she says she stands with Malala, and that she believes that, quote unquote, women, and she said we, are powerful. And that fact was incredible. I think that confidence that comes with tackling so big is exactly the attitude that we need in the youth in order to really have gender equality become a reality. Because it's not just in the developing countries, right? It's all over. It's even in the industrial nations, right? Even in this current political campaign for the next president of the United States, gender has always been a topic that they, inadvertently talk about. To your right, the red box, you'll note something else that we did. During my time at Yale University, I was able to conduct a gender equality survey, and this was a really random case survey, which we went to 10 random girls on campus, and they were between the ages of 18 and 22, and we asked them, when you think about gender equality, what does that mean to you? And the girls said the following words: choice, empowerment, freedom, power, equality, voice, love, strength, daughter, economic success, development, education, sister, independence, revolution, no stereotypes, change, life, equal rights, equal access to education, fair, leadership, mother, and my personal favorite, the future is now, and then equality. So I really love these words, because I think they are exactly the words that propel this entire focus and this entire goal of one day reaching gender equality. And it was by the young girls. It's by the people who are going to lead this movement further. I'd like to focus now on a video by UNICEF, which is very statistically driven. And UNICEF, for those of you who don't know, is the United Nations Children's Fund, who works for children's rights, survival, development, and protection. It is one of the leading humanitarian organizations in the world. So the next video goes for their credit. They made the video, and it's a phenomenal one to watch. And let's listen and watch UNICEF experts in the field tackling gender inequality.
Gender-based inequality. Reversing the wrongs endured by girls and women is not just a matter of doing what's right. For this long excluded and vulnerable global majority, access, protection, and development of their potential can be the difference between life and death. In more than 150 countries around the world, UNICEF works to provide children with what they need to survive and thrive: medicine and immunizations, clean water, nutrition, education, emergency relief, and protection from violence and exploitation. From improving maternal health to fighting for an end to gender-based violence, from ensuring that girls get a basic education to working to end female genital mutilation, UNICEF integrates gender equity into its life-saving programs all over the globe. One battle UNICEF fights is to ensure that girls get an education. Over 36 million girls do not have a place in school. But without gender equity in education, the world's health and development goals cannot be reached.
Educated girls grow up to be more productive. They're more likely to be healthy. Their children are more likely to survive. They become more empowered, and they wind up making a huge contribution to societies.
UNICEF makes schools more accessible to girls by training female teachers, building separate sanitation facilities for both sexes, and developing curricula that empower girls and build their confidence and independence. Another challenge UNICEF is committed to tackling is maternal health.
Maternal mortality is very much a gender equity issue. It relates to the low status of women in society. Women's health issues are frequently not talked about.
UNICEF trains local health workers and mothers to recognize pregnancy complications, improves pregnant women's nutrition, and immunizes them against deadly diseases like maternal and neonatal tetanus. And for the 1.4 million pregnant women living with HIV, UNICEF works to prevent the transmission of the AIDS virus to their infants, providing them with antiretroviral drugs and giving their babies these life-saving medicines for their first 6 weeks of life.
There are so many miracles that happen in life. Surely if these programs did not exist, many people could have died.
Despite Jane Butete's HIV status, thanks to this UNICEF-assisted program, her baby son Ngone was born HIV negative. Without intervention, babies born to HIV-positive mothers have a 30% chance of contracting the virus, while mothers who participate in the prevention program can lower their baby's risk to 2%. But girls and women need more than health and education programs. Gender-based violence is a worldwide scourge that threatens and devastates, and 150 million girls under 18 have experienced rape or other forms of sexual violence. 12-year-old Selena lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo and is one of the many victims of gender-based violence.
I went to fetch water, and when I was almost finished, I felt someone come behind me. He took a stone and stuffed it in my mouth and carried me off into the bushes. He hit me in the face and held my throat and then raped me.
UNICEF combats gender-based violence by partnering with frontline responders, community workers, and law enforcement to ensure that they understand that women have the right to protection from violence. UNICEF is also working so that girls and women who are victims of violence can get help and support in hospitals, health centers, and schools without fear of discrimination. The challenges millions of girls and women face are daunting, But in developing countries all over the world, they are eager to learn, grow, and take control of their lives. And with the help of UNICEF and its partners, their potential is limitless, not only to improve their own lives, but to change the world for the better.
So let's talk about how incredible that video was, and I think this video in particular talked more about statistics and the impact of gender-based inequality. But that really does go to show you how there are multiple organizations around the world that are taking key initiative in ensuring that, gender-based inequality is not something for the future. And if we tackle it early and promote education, that can be the catalyst to really providing an equal playing field. I like to divert our attention now to the sociology of gender equality, and it's a really great segue from that video going into here, because the key role really is to understanding gender roles. And we have to understand that each country has its own definition of what the gender roles are. Although it is still stratified as being men as a dominant gender in the society and women being inferior, there are still very detailed roles that in each culture a man versus a woman does. Now, in argument, there was something called the Iroquois Confederacy that had a very interesting role for women, and it was actually more so and equal. But, arguably that could even be something completely different. And again, that's just for your own knowledge. But let's go back on here to the roles that we're talking about. So socio-structural roles are very important, and that also plays into gender roles. And what does that cover? That covers culture, the patriarchal nature of society, because as we mentioned earlier, there is that stratification. The gender division of labor is what we note, right? Typically, the men are the hunter-gatherers, whereas the women are the nourishers, and the women do all the domestic housework. But also, it's interesting to note that although they do the domestic housework, they're typically the ones that get the least end of everything. So when everything, these are such general terms, but they are actually very true. Even when it comes to food, right? When it comes to food, the woman will first feed her children and then feed her husband, and then at the very end, she'll feed herself. So there is this, this sense of I am least important type of mentality also that is ingrained in these young girls. And then when they become women, they are only trained to give, and not invest in themselves, which is unacceptable, because unless you invest in yourself, you won't be able to do well. And to continue with what we mean by gender roles, that also encompasses race and class. And again, let's talk, and like we mentioned earlier, these roles really did start from the era of cavemen, and throughout history we noted that even in pre-colonial native confederacies like the Iroquois, and there is a transition and conditioned into past industrial gender roles for developed countries, and now there is still a significant gap in developing countries. But if we do look through the line of history, there has been an underlying tone, right, of men being superior to women, but in each decade or in each particular demographic and geographic location, that just varies by culture and by religion. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is confronting gender roles and gender violence. We really do need to also focus in divesting men of misogyny and sexism. And we need to also confront traditional masculinity and talk about women as enforcers of gender conformity. And that's what I kind of mentioned earlier, right? When women look at themselves as inferior and will further train their young boys to be more dominant than their girls. So this is something that is conditioned. Like we mentioned earlier, this is something that's taught. And although you can go through gender inequality yourself, there needs to be a time where those same women can say, this is not something that I want for my children. And we have noted that there is a trend like this, but there's also a trend where the same cycle continues over and over and over again, and the only difference is access to education. Once that education is gained, it really does change everything. It not only changes the economic prosperity of the area, but the mental perspective about gender really changes. And with that, it allows girls and women to take on roles that they didn't even think was an option for them. The third point I'd like to touch base on is changing the principles and practice of gender roles and emphasizing the concept of accountability, equality, and religious ideologies. We do know that there is a transition to religious and cultural gender roles, which translated to historical gender roles, how this all translates to our current inequities here in all sectors, or in many sectors, for women. For this slide, I'd like us to consider a case study. And I'd like us to focus on Lisa Grand, who is the UNDP resident representative in India. And let this case study be about women and gender inequality in India. As quoted by Lisa Grand, ensuring gender equality is one of the most pressing development challenges facing India today. Now, she recognizes, and will note later in her analysis that I'm about to play for you, the radio interview, will note that she really does address this as a multifaceted issue, because it is not just one sector. And there's a couple points that I'd like to discuss before we play the radio interview. And that is that before we tackle this issue of gender inequality, we need to understand the progressive framework of the country, the governmental framework of the country. If policies are not in the favor of women, which sometimes they really are not because they are made predominantly for men, how do we expect this equality to be safeguarded and to be sustained over the years? So if we were to invest these millions and millions of dollars in ensuring gender equality, then we need to also ensure that that money is going to have a sustained impact. And how can we have a sustained impact if the policies and the government is not streamlined with the needs of the people? The second point that I'd like to point out is representation in government. In India, they have a parliament, and we need to think about, and not just, and this is just in general as well, if we want to reform policy and we want to reform multi-sector issues for women, then we have to understand that the majority of the folks in the parliament are men. So the reform policy discussions are going to be done by men. But in order for this discussion and these policies to be impactful and meaningful for women, we need to allow women to be a part of this representative government. Women need to be a part of those discussions, because it will really change the social dynamic of A, what women can do, and B, the way that impacts, the way that a woman can think for another woman. I'm sure the many girls and women who are listening to this do understand that they have a completely different perspective of the needs and requirements. And that's why this is really a partnership issue, right? This is not just an argument for women, but also, something for women and men together to tackle, and perhaps with the leadership of women. They do understand this more. So I'm going to now play the UN radio interview, and let's touch base after and see what you think.
I think that many people would regard being a woman in India as difficult. This is borne out by the fact that India as a country ranks in the bottom 25% of all countries on the Gender Equality Index. This is indicative of a number of factors in the country. Women are very poorly represented in the formal workforce. They are the victim of deep-seated prejudices, and violence against women is pervasive across all classes and all regions. I think we would have to regard the situation of women. I mean, there have been some improvements, but it is still arguably
one of the most pressing and difficult development problems that India as a country is facing.
It sounds as though it's a mammoth task dealing with these issues in such a big and diverse country.
I think that's right, and I think the fact that in Parliament, out of more than 530 seats, only 61 of them are actually held by women. Approximately 11%, just a little bit over 11% of parliamentary seats are actually held by women. That means that the critical decisions that have to be taken about how the country is going to address this problem are being taken by men.
Where do you start? Is this something that you start at the top or at the grassroots, or both?
One of the impressive features about India is that it has such a well-organized and active civil society, and the women's movement as part of civil society has a long and very proud history, and the women's movement has been active on all of these issues, on political participation, on rolling back prejudices, on getting more women involved in the workforce and improving living conditions for them. We also have to recognize that India has very progressive legislation on the books, equal property rights and so forth. Now, the implementation of that, I think, is something which still is a challenge, but at least the progressive framework, by and large, is in place. We also have to recognize that there is real political will being generated to change things. The new prime minister recently elected has said that he regards women's security as one of his country's top priorities. So you take all that together, and I think that that indicates that a lot of people in India know that the situation is bad, and the situation has to change, and it has to change now.
How optimistic are you that change will come?
I think that one of the structural factors that impacts on the position of women is the widespread occurrence of dowry. When women are bought and sold through dowry, it impacts everything. And certainly addressing this very pervasive social practice would seem to me as one of the necessary conditions at a fundamental level for changing the status of women in the country.
Looking at India from the outside, it seems quite a progressive country, as you've said. What's it like in reality?
It's a privilege to serve in India. I think all of us who are posted there with the United Nations and with other international organizations feel that we are in India at a remarkable time in its history. The country is emerging as a great regional power, in fact, as a superpower. And to be there during that process is something which I treasure very much.
That was a great case study. What I found to be very interesting about that is how, in order for this to be a fair argument, we need to say that in order to provide equalities as well for women in the underdeveloped regions of India, the government representation needs to be more inclusive of women. And it's really great to see that there is people on the ground. There are international organizations on the ground working day in and day out to ensure gender equality. I'd like to segue now into notable actions, and this really does go well with what Lisa Grand was talking about, how there are programs now set in place and how we do need to do more work to really expedite this faster and to make it more efficiently and in a more impactful way. There are 3 points that I'd like to discuss here, and the first one is about the launch of the UN Women's He for She campaign in 2014. Later, we're going to watch a video by Emma Watson herself, who is a Goodwill ambassador for He for She campaign, and she really does drive home a really important fact about how men, who are the he, really need to be involved in gender equality, which from a very long time seems like an issue only led by women. So this, in essence, and this is a really great quote that you'll listen to later, is she claims that this is a quote-unquote formal invitation for men to be a part of the conversation, which I think is great. And later on when you watch the video, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. The second point that I'd like to touch on is the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals in September 2015. Pendulum Global got a very exciting opportunity to be at the United Nations during this time frame for the Millennium Campus Network Conference. We were nominated for something called the Millennium Peace Prize, and we were in a space where although we were a finalist, we didn't go completely through, but it was still an opportunity for us to be there at the UN and to see the excitement around the Sustainable Development Goals in September. And we'll touch base on this a little more going forward. But the reason why the Sustainable Development Goals is very important is because they really do all reaffirm the importance of equality for women. And you see this throughout all 17 of the goals that we'll discuss later on. And the third point that I'd like to touch upon is the Global Leaders Meeting on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. And this was also during September, and it was a commitment to action. And what I found that would be great for us to discuss and to talk about during this webinar are the commitments that were made during this meeting. And below are a couple commitments, and I'd like to read them to you. The first commitment was investing in gender equality at the national and international levels. Believe it or not, there are still many countries that have not taken the initiative to make this a reality. Either they have cultural or religious impediments that don't allow for this to happen, or it's a very suppressive government. And with time, and we have noted that with enough people involvement and just the concern by the general populace at the level of initiating something very momentous, we see that it really does influence the way the government creates new policies and perhaps opens the doors to these discussions in the future. So the primary goal really is to have all national, all countries. So nationally for us here in the United States, for us in all 50 states to be very strong about gender equality in the workplace, but also on an international level, gender equality for all aspects of life, which, quite frankly, I think in the United States we might take a little for granted. The second point is updating or establishing new action plans, strategies, and policies on gender equality. So again, it's really organizing around this commitment, around this issue. The third is enhancing women's leadership and participation at all levels of decision making. And this really does reaffirm the point by Lisa Grand, and it really does reaffirm the point made by World Fish Organization earlier and made by UNICEF earlier in the videos, which is that we need to give women the platform in order to be a part of the conversations and make the decisions. And women have done a great job of doing that so far, but there are still challenges that come their way. And if we want to make this successful, we really need to break down those walls and allow for this to be more fluid. The fourth point that I'd like to talk about is introducing new laws or reviewing and implementing existing ones to promote gender equality. It is one thing to create legislation for gender equality and to have all these agenda goals and have all of these discussions about it, but it's another concept to implement the goals and the visions that are very may be very vast and arguably maybe a little too unrealistic to achieve, but it's really on how you create the protocols and the channels to achieve the goals what matters. So again, really implementing the existing laws that were set in place and the new laws that will be set in place to promote gender equality. The fifth point is preventing and addressing social norms and stereotypes that condone gender inequality, discrimination, and violence. As we've noted in history, every time we want to have a movement and we want to do something that is very, paradigm shifting, there is always setback, there is always pushback. Inevitably, there will be an experience of, violence with this, although the best way to go forward is peaceful, but it's really also protection. How do we create protection for these campaigns, and how do we create sustainability for these campaigns, and how do we create it in the framework to protect these campaigns for gender equality? And also, how do we limit stigma? Stigma is an issue that we've noted is so critical to any type of change that happens. A girl in a village, if she decides to get an education, instantaneously there will be stigma on her for breaking away from the status quo. How do we create programs, or how do we create an infrastructure for that individual to not feel suppressed by her achievement and by her ability to break away from the suppression? How do we build a framework to help her create more opportunities for more young girls in her community is the real question. So addressing the social norms and creating protection barriers for people who have escaped the system and are able to then stand up for what is right is really a question that we should be having, or that we should be answering as well. And the sixth point is launching public mobilization and national campaigns to promote gender equality. And I think the sixth one really does go into the rest. And, this is, again, mobilization is the way to go. And this is something, like we said earlier, that, there is two ways to handle an issue for gender, against gender inequality. And that is either we look at it from the top down or we look at it from the bottom up. But if it happens on both levels, if there's an effort made from the top down and there is public mobilization from the bottom up through grassroots organizations, then there is real promise for achieving the goals that we want. Now, I'd like to transition into another video about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'd like to hear what you think. And this is a video about the Millennium Development Goals transitioning into the Sustainable Development Goals. So let's touch base after the video.
In the year 2000, leaders from 189 countries agreed on a vision for the new millennium. They wanted to end extreme poverty in all of its forms. So they made a list of 8 goals, called the Millennium Development Goals, and they wanted to achieve these goals in 15 years. One of the leading organizations working to fulfill these goals has been the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. We're present in more than 170 countries and territories. We championed the goals so that people everywhere would know what they were and how people could do their part. We funded projects that helped fulfill the goals. We helped countries accelerate NDG progress by breaking down the silos and working across sectors. We acted as scorekeeper, helping countries to track progress. As a result, the number of people that live on less than $1.25 per day has dropped by more than half. The number of primary school-age kids who don't go to school, down by almost half. The number of people getting life-saving treatment for HIV increased by over 15 times. Child mortality, down by almost half. As much progress as we have made together, there's still a lot more to do. Over 800 million people are still living on less than $1.25 a day. 1 in 9 people on our planet goes to sleep hungry each night. Deforestation remains alarmingly high in many countries. Oceans are becoming more acidic, threatening food security and marine ecosystems. And about 1 of every 6 adults in the world is illiterate. 2/3 of them are women. We think those are tough numbers, and so do leaders from the countries where we work. So in September 2015, they agreed on a new set of goals to help finish the work we all started in 2000. The new goals are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. We have made significant progress in the last 15 years, and we think there's plenty of room for hope, for action, in the next 15 years. Today, the world is more connected by technology. We know more about how to balance the 3 pillars of sustainable development: social progress, economic growth, and environmental protection. However, our climate is changing. Our planet is transforming, and there are more people on Earth than ever before. We at UNDP believe everyone can have enough of what they need living within our planetary boundaries, and we are working around the world to make this happen. Our goals to reach by 2030 are to eradicate extreme poverty, protect our environment, and much more. UNDP has 50 years of experience working with countries to make this a more prosperous, healthy, inclusive, and sustainable world. Join us.
I hope you enjoyed the video about how the Millennium Development Goals transition to the Sustainable Development Goals. as you've seen, we've had a lot of accomplishments in the past 15 years, from 2000 since its inception till 2015, and now hopefully post 2015 and as 2016 has started, really hope to hit new milestones, right? When you have new solutions, you inherently have new challenges, and the Sustainable Development Goals really does an inclusive job of incorporating and addressing the majority of those challenges. And let's see in the next 15 years what are going to be the new goals that we try to work towards. For this slide, I'd like to focus Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is gender equality. And an astonishing fact is that women work 70% of the world's working hours, yet earn only 10% of the world's income. And again, this really is a driving force behind the importance of gender equality. Because remember, gender equality is not just a human rights issue and a universal issue and a universal right, but it is also vital for economic prosperity and for destroying the cycle of poverty in the developing world. If you don't engage half the population, how do you expect to get out of poverty? To analyze goal number 5 in more depth, remember, the goal really does talk about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls. And it does so in about 6 different points that I think are important for us to discuss about this goal. And the first point is that the goal is to end all forms of discrimination against all women and girls everywhere. Remember, discrimination is in many forms, and it can be discrimination in the labor force, discrimination in the household, discrimination in society as a whole. The second point I'd like to touch on is eliminating all forms of violence against all women and girls in public and private spheres. And this really does embody something that I think the U.S. Fund for UNICEF is doing a great job of tackling, and that is human trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitation for girls and women. I think that also falls under this umbrella of gender equality. The third point that I'd like to touch on is eliminating the hateful practices, such as child and early forced marriage and female genital mutilation. By eliminating these harmful practices that can arguably be deeply ingrained in culture, it really does allow for a new era of those women and girls to realize that they have a lot more that they can achieve when they are looked as equals to the boys who are growing up and the men there as well. The fourth point is recognizing and valuing unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility within the household and the family as nationally appropriate, right? Because, like we said earlier, each country has its own system, each community has its own system, each household has its own system and its own division of labor also. So seeing how the division of labor changes over time when we make these paradigm shifts will also be a vital point in understanding how to eliminate gender inequality. The fifth point is ensuring that women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities leadership at all levels. And like we mentioned earlier, and like mentioned by Lisa Grand earlier, if we don't incorporate women in the social infrastructure, in the governmental infrastructure, how do we intend to make the reforms of gender equality that we hope to achieve? The answer is simple. The answer is we won't be able to achieve those. So it is imperative to have women join the conversations at that executive level, because that is the level of decision making. In order to achieve gender equality, not only is this an issue from the bottom up through public mobilization and nonprofit organizations, but also from the top down, from the government, from policies, from community organizers. And the sixth point that I'd like to mention is ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as agreed in accordance with the Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Platform for Action and the outcome documents of their review conferences. This was something that was imperative and mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals if you looked in deeper analysis of the goal. And it's quite interesting how this is not achieved yet. You would think, it would be an inherent realization that everybody has the right to their body and everybody has the right to make decisions for their own body, and then a third party should never make decisions about sexual and reproductive decisions or health or rights about another person. And this is something that I think is one of the most crucial ones, because this allows the women and the girls who are and who have been marginalized by the superiors in society not feel like they own their own bodies. And ownership of your body is a right, is a universal right. And to have this taken away is a whole new, I think that's a whole new topic of discussion. So I'm really happy personally that we are addressing this, but it's bittersweet because at the same time, it's a bit discouraging and a bit sad because I'm sad that we have not achieved this yet. So I'm really hoping that this is one that will be expedited and achieved very quickly. And under this, there are 3 more subclasses of points to mention. The first is the undertaking of reforms really to give women equal rights to economic resources, as we mentioned earlier with Lisa Grand, as well as access to ownership and control over land, as mentioned in the World Fish Program video at the very beginning. If you don't give women the access to land, how can they have the autonomy and the flexibility to manage their own businesses? How can they be economic self-sufficient without owning their own land? And that also entails the concept of financial services, inheritance, and natural resources. And of course, we want this to be in accordance to the national laws, which is why it's so important to get the governments involved in these conversations so we can have impact from the top down. The second point or subpoint to talk about is the enhancement and the use of enabling technology. The 21st century, we have technology at our fingertips, and technology should be an asset that we really use in achieving these goals. And that really doesn't also incorporate communication technology, because that can really be the catalyst to promoting empowerment for women. It can connect more women, and it can share stories and really share resources amongst organizations as well. And the last subpoint really is to adopt and strengthen sound practices and enforce the legislation. So it's not just about having the legislation, it's not just about talking about the issues, it's really about implementing them and ensuring that we do it in the most efficient and impactful way. In this slide, we will be talking about the UN interview of Amna J. Mohammed, who is a special advisor to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the post-2015 planning. And what I really liked about this interview with Amna J. Mohammed is how she really talks about, and this is one of her quotes, how gender needs to be addressed and mainstreamed across all goals. So she really does address the fact that in all 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there is a way to incorporate gender equality in all of them. So now let's take a listen to an interview of Amna J. Mohammed and her analysis of the post-2015 goals and the importance of incorporating girls in the Sustainable Development Goals.
The MDGs are clearly the greatest and most successful anti-poverty campaign established in history, with incredible focus on the poor and most marginalized, including women and girls. Through the MDGs' progress, though slow and uneven, there has been made an advance in gender equality. Disparities in primary school enrollment between boys and girls are being eliminated in most developing regions. The political participation of women has continued to increase, but in no country in the world has yet achieved gender equality. The post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda recognizes that gender equality, the empowerment of women and girls, and the full realization of their human rights are essential to achieve sustainable development. The post-2015 agenda is a universal agenda, and it will leave no one behind. All the goals are intrinsically interrelated and interdependent. We believe that gender needs to be addressed and mainstreamed across all goals. Eradicating poverty irreversibly cannot be achieved without gender equality or climate action, and vice versa. Through unlocking the potential and empowering women and ensuring equal distribution of power, resources and opportunities, we will be able to promote sustainable development by also combating poverty, promoting just and safe societies, and protecting the environment. Clearly, data will be the lifeblood of decision-making and the raw material for accountability. A data revolution which increases the usefulness of data to empower people, better policies and decisions. With disaggregated data, we will make the invisible women and girls visible. Mainstreaming gender and its intersection with the other development goals, an integrated and a universal agenda, requires ensuring coherence and linkages between social, economic and environmental policies. The support and participation of men and boys in ending violence and discrimination against women and girls will be key. Sexual and reproductive health and rights to be able to make decisions about when she will study or work, or how many children she is able to raise and provide for. Enabling environments and equal opportunities for women and girls to education and technology, equal wages and rights to land, inheritance and social status must be addressed. Ensuring women's full and equal participation and leadership in decision-making in public and private spheres, including the implementation of the post-2015 development agenda, which should ensure democracy and legitimacy of the process. This must be at all levels, local, national, and global. Well, to quote Mahatma Gandhi, be the change that you wish to see in the world. As a young girl growing up in deeply traditional northeastern Nigeria, working in a country's male-dominated workforce, one faced many obstacles in my life to subsequently becoming an advisor to 3 presidents and the Secretary General. But it all really started by becoming an advocate for myself and others in my home, community, and eventually my professional life. Women and girls must speak up, they must get involved, and they must take risks in speaking truth to power in the establishment where there are many voiceless. And often when we speak up, we find we're not alone and garner the courage within each other and to stand up for what is right that shifts the tides of inequality. I do find inspiration in women having a seat at the table and making great change. And from my own continent of origin in Africa, I see a growing number of women in leadership positions, including President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia and Dr. Dlamini Zuma, chairperson of the African Union, in addition to a rising number of women politicians in Rwanda and across the continent. But I also find inspiration from the growing number of men who are fighting to end gender inequality, and we must continue to cultivate understanding and enlist their support to realize a truly equal world, as UN Women would say, he for she.
That was a very impactful interview by Amna J. Muhammad. One of the highlights of her interview was her belief in the cultivation of activism from the growing number of men, and I really liked how she referenced UN Women and its campaign, He for She, which is what the symbol is on the which is the symbol that's on the page as well. Another very interesting point that I'd like to point out is something that she said about the data revolution that is very important. It is very important to note that effective metrics, monitoring, and data collection is one of the most important and imperative tasks and ways to ensure that we are meeting the milestones that we claim to have met. Now, if we note this is something that isn't really discussed really openly, but throughout my readings for this webinar, I did come across a reading that mentioned how the Millennium Development Goal monitoring gave us little attention on what should be measured. So right now, to this day, there are some lacks of important metrics for key development priorities. Similarly, we noted that there were too little investment in strengthening statistical capacity to ensure effective real-time monitoring of the Millennium Development Goals and to establish statistical standards and quality requirements. So essentially, by the technology trend and by us really leveraging technology and ensuring and creating a system for effective data collection and data usage, that will really be the driving force. Now, to again shift gears again, the following video that I'm about to show you will be going in depth about the last thing that Najee Muhammad talked about, which was the He for She campaign. Now, the He for She campaign in this next video that you'll see is being discussed by Emma Watson at the United Nations, and so the next video is made by the United Nations. And so let's watch and listen to this very momentous time, because although men were always a part of the conversation, this really was a flagship, allowing men to be, quote unquote, formally invited to the conversation. Because remember, gender inequality is not just a human rights issue, and it's not just an issue for women, but it's also an issue for men. Because let's think about it. What are the women in a man's life? You have your mother, you have your sister, you have your friends who are girls, you have your grandmother, and you have your daughter. So this becomes a very personable case now. So it's not just, any random person. It's become somebody who you love and who you cherish and who you care about. And remember, as a global citizen, we do have a responsibility for all women and all boys and all girls and all men. So let's continue with the video, and I'd love to get perspective after.
And now let's turn to a young woman who has chosen to lend her voice to this very important solidarity movement. She's a leading British actor, an advocate for gender equality in her own right. She's been involved with the promotion of girls' education for several years. As part of her humanitarian efforts, she's visited Bangladesh, Zambia, recently returned, as we just heard, from Uruguay, on her first mission with UN Women. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to this stage our co-host and the UN Women's Global Goodwill Ambassador, Emma Watson.
Your Excellencies, UN Secretary General, President of the General Assembly, Executive Director of UN Women, and distinguished guests. Today, we are launching a campaign called He for She. I am reaching out to you because we need your help. We want to end gender inequality, and to do this, we need everyone involved. This is the first campaign of its kind at the UN. We want to try and galvanize as many men and boys as possible to be advocates for change. And we don't just want to talk about it. We want to try and make sure that it's tangible. I was appointed as Goodwill Ambassador for UN Women 6 months ago. And the more I've spoken about feminism, the more I have realized that fighting for women's rights has too often become synonymous with man-hating. If there is one thing I know for certain, it is that this has to stop. For the record, feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities. It is the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. I started questioning gender-based assumptions a long time ago. When I was 8, I was confused being called bossy because I wanted to direct the plays that we would put on for our parents, but the boys were not. When at 14, I started to be sexualized by certain elements of the media. When at 15, my girlfriends started dropping out of their beloved sports teams because they didn't want to appear muscly. When at 18, my male friends were unable to express their feelings. I decided that I was a feminist, and this seemed uncomplicated to me. But my recent research has shown me that feminism has become an unpopular word. Women are choosing not to identify as feminist. Apparently, I am among the ranks of women whose expressions are seen as too strong, too aggressive, isolating, and anti-men, unattractive even. Why has the word become such an uncomfortable one? I am from Britain, and I think it is right that I am paid the same as my male counterparts. I think it is right that I should be able to make decisions about my own body. I think it is right that women be involved on my behalf in the policies and the decisions that will affect my life. I think it is right that socially I am afforded the same respect as men. But sadly, I can say that there is no one country in the world where all women can expect to receive these rights. No country in the world can yet say that they have achieved gender equality. These rights I consider to be human rights, but I am one of the lucky ones. My life is a sheer privilege because my parents didn't love me less because I was born a daughter. My school did not limit me because I was a girl. My mentors didn't assume that I would go less far because I might give birth to a child one day. These influences were the gender equality ambassadors that made me who I am today. They may not know it, but they are the inadvertent feminists who are changing the world today. We need more of those. And if you still hate the word, it is not the word that is important. It's the idea and the ambition behind it. Because not all women have received the same rights that I have. In fact, statistically, very few have been. In 1997, Hillary Clinton made a famous speech in Beijing about women's rights. Sadly, many of the things that she wanted to change are still true today. But what stood out for me the most was that less than 30% of the audience were male. How can we affect change in the world when only half of it is invited or feel welcome to participate in the conversation? Men, I would like to take this opportunity to extend your formal invitation. Gender equality is your issue too. Because to date, I've seen my father's role as a parent being valued less by society, despite my needing his presence as a child as much as my mother's. I've seen young men suffering from mental illness, unable to ask for help, for fear it would make them less of a man or less of a man. In fact, in the UK, suicide is the biggest killer of men between 20 to 49, eclipsing road accidents, cancer, and coronary heart disease. I've seen men made fragile and insecure by a distorted sense of what constitutes male success. Men don't have the benefits of equality either. We don't often talk about men being imprisoned by gender stereotypes, but I can see that they are, and that when they are free, things will change for women as a natural consequence. If men don't have to be aggressive in order to be accepted, women won't feel compelled to be submissive. If men don't have to control, women won't have to be controlled. Both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum instead of two sets of opposing ideals. If we stop defining each other by what we are not and start defining ourselves by who we are, we can all be freer. And this is what he for she is about. It's about freedom. I want men to take up this mantle so that their daughters, sisters, and mothers can be free from prejudice, but also so that their sons have permission to be vulnerable and human too. Reclaim those parts of themselves they abandoned, and in doing so, be a more true and complete version of themselves. You might be thinking, who is this Harry Potter girl? And what is she doing speaking at the UN? And it's a really good question. I've been asking myself the same thing. All I know is that I care about this problem, and I want to make it better. And having seen what I've seen, and given the chance, I feel it is my responsibility to say something. Statesman Edmund Burke said, "All that is needed for the forces of evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing." In my nervousness for this speech, and in my moments of doubt, I've told myself firmly, if not me, who? If not now, when? If you have similar doubts when opportunities are presented to you, I hope that those words will be helpful. Because the reality is that if we do nothing, it will take 75 years, or for me to be nearly 100, before women can expect to be paid the same as men for the same work. 15.5 million girls will be married in the next 16 years as children. And at current rates, it won't be until 2086 before all rural African girls can have a secondary education. If you believe in equality, you might be one of those inadvertent feminists that I spoke of earlier. And for this, I applaud you. We are struggling for a uniting word, but the good news is that we have a uniting movement. It is called He for She. I am inviting you to step forward, to be seen, and to ask yourself, if not me, who? If not now, when? Thank you very, very much.
What a beautiful, beautiful speech. What a beautiful thought. Emma, pay attention.
I think that was simply a very powerful video, and He for She is a phenomenal campaign to get involved with, and I encourage everybody who's listening as well to go to heforshe.org and to sign up as a commitment maker. And it's very easy. You just sign your name and you officially become a commitment maker, and you do it through social media. And again, the premise of the campaign is a solidarity movement for gender equality. And the amount of support that it has been getting globally is phenomenal. And I'd also like to mention that Pendulum Global, we support UN Women and He for She's campaign because it gives momentum to our own girls' empowerment campaign that we hope to launch in the Republic of the Philippines. And I would like to also discuss a little bit about gender inequality as a whole, and why, what would be like the take-home message for it. And I think that is, there is never an act too small for gender inequality. So whether that be in the workplace, or whether that be anything domestic, or even anything international, and that can be so much for leveraging your voice, or acknowledging that that is inequality, and acknowledging that that is incorrect, is a step in the right direction. So I would just say, be cognizant of the inequities around you, and you will be astonished about how much work needs to be done. I hope this webinar was educational, and please note that all of the videos in this webinar are not our own, and you can find them all on YouTube. In addition, on the next page, you'll find a list of all of the resources that we used in terms of the facts that I mentioned throughout my lectures. They're all from these various resources on the 17th slide that you'll see the next slide. And if you have any questions, or you have any suggestions, or you just want to talk about this more, please feel free to engage us in conversation. Our email is volunteer@pendulumglobal.org. Thank you for listening, and I hope you watch the next one. Thanks.